So Byzantine iconoclasm rarely fails to spark the imagination. And in part, I suspect that this is due to the perennial appeal of the icon as one of Byzantium's most enduring cultural symbols. It is often through the icon that many of us first encounter this empire, as rows of gleaming sacred images in museums or Orthodox churches. And they appear to us as timeless, because such is their intent. The idea then that at one time such images were contested continues to underlie our fascination with the period of Byzantine iconoclasm. Now, iconoclasm is a visceral term. For those of us born or educated within the European Protestant tradition, it all too readily conjures up popular images of the Reformation or the French Revolution, of defaced statues, smashed stained glass, violence, and occasionally death. Byzantine iconoclasm, as we will see, has very little in common with these more recent iconoclastic episodes. But the issues raised during the 150-year period of the dispute about the relationship between the image and prototype, about the control of history and the power of memory, and about the power of the image itself have relevance today. And nowhere is this clearer than in recent episodes of iconoclasm in the UK and the USA directed at statues associated with the history of slavery. And these have once more raised essential questions. What is exactly being attacked here? Is it the materiality of the image itself, its artistic or its economic value? Is it the person, the institution, the idea that the image is held to embody? And are the actions of the iconoclasts morally justifiable? Or are they reprehensible? Theories of iconoclasm offer us no clear-cut solutions to these issues, but they force us to think beyond the image itself and into more existential questions about the values that we hold as individuals and as a society, about the power struggle inherent within the definition of memory and what history is, and into the relationship between the image and its prototype. Iconoclasm also reminds us that even today, when global literacy now stands at 87%, the power of the image in this world will not be easily supplanted. Byzantium was the first European society to effectively battle with these questions, and the debates that were first set out in the empire between 720 and 843 still hold valuable lessons today. But to understand how the Byzantines viewed this period also requires something of a caveat. The combined term Byzantine iconoclasm did not exist until the 1950s. Byzantium, as many of us know, is a 16th century term to describe the medieval Roman Empire, which existed in various forms until the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans in 1453. The Byzantines, however, never ceased to consider themselves to be Roman. Iconoclasm, concocted from two Greek words, ikon, image, klastis, breaker, did not fully make its way into English until the 19th century. The Byzantines themselves referred to this period as iconomachy, the battle or struggle for images, a term which is less focused on the act of destruction and more about the question on the role of images within Christian worship. So partly our need to equate Byzantine iconoclasm with destruction lies in the cultural baggage that we have inherited since the 16th century. But it also owes much to the perceptions of the victorious image supporters, the iconophiles, who rewrote the history of the struggle after 843 and ensured the denigration of the memories of their opponents, the iconoclasts. And that legacy is still to be seen today, in the slanderous nicknames assigned to iconoclast emperors like Constantine V, the Kopronimos, named after dung, or in the illuminated Byzantine manuscripts like this, in which iconoclasts are likened to the soldiers who taunted Christ on the cross. But in terms of evidence for actual image destruction, we possess very little. Indeed, a church council held by iconoclast clergy prohibited the removal of images from churches without express imperial consent. Only a single example, which may be linked to an official decree, is documented in contemporary sources. And this occurred in Constantinople in the Synkrotron, which was an audience chamber in the great church of Aya Sophia. Now, during the 760s, the patriarch Nicetas is said to have ordered a series of mosaic panels depicting Christ and the saints to be removed from this chamber. Traces of image removal which still relate to this episode are still to be seen in the upper register of the wall. And in this case, disruption to the mosaic tessera beneath the depiction of two crosses reveals the former existence of inscriptions which once named the holy persons depicted in the roundel. But clearly these images were erased sensitively, and they show that Byzantine experiences of iconoclasm were very different from more recent understandings of the term. So how did the Byzantine struggle over images come about? Well, Byzantine concerns over religious images did not fully emerge until the 8th century, but the use of images within Christianity predated the iconoclast dispute by centuries. Now, Christianity became the dominant religion within the Roman Empire around about the late 4th century, and images featuring portraits of holy people appeared around about this time. But in this early period, their purpose was purely commemorative. Divine power was sought through relics. It was not until the 7th century that icons, as we now understand them, were ascribed a similar status to relics in their ability to transmit the presence of a holy saint. Now, the earliest clear description of this power dates to the late 7th century. And this is a text known as On the Holy Places, which was written by Adamnan, the abbot of Iona, an island off the coast of Scotland. And the text preserves a story from Constantinople. And the story relates how a man who was about to set off for war stood before a portrait of the Holy Confessor George and prayed for deliverance from the dangers of that war. This story represents the earliest documented case where an icon is described as having borne the ever-presence of a saint and being revered in a manner that had previously only been reserved for relics. The man is described as having spoken to the image, and the Confessor George, ever present in his icon, responded by ensuring his safety. Such a radical shift in the status accorded to icons responded to several changes in the empire in the 7th century. The 7th century was a period of perpetual crisis for Byzantium. The Byzantine-Persian War of 602 to 628 inflicted heavy territorial and military losses. By 632, the politically and economically depleted empire faced further threats from the Muslim Arab incursions into Byzantine territory following the death of Muhammad. And within a decade, the empire had lost all of its Levantine territories and its Egyptian ones too, and the remaining parts of the empire were subject to repeated military assaults. In this time of crisis, icons emerged as a means through which prayer could be effectively channeled by people in need of divine aid. Contemporary writers often try to explain these crises as a result of God's punishment of Christians. And one sin that they were particularly worried about was idolatry. But the change in the role of images that had taken place in these difficult times was also met by an immediate institutional response. In 692, a church council was convened in the imperial palace at Constantinople, and it established the first canonical rulings on imagery. Canon 82 of the council issued prohibitions against symbolic images by insisting that all images must represent historic reality. Henceforth, Christ was not to be depicted as a Lamb of God, but to be shown in his fully human form. Now, the rulings of the 692 Council evidently responded to a growing awareness about the power of images, but also the potential danger of abuse. Now, the first instances of anti-image sentiment are not documented until around about 30 years later in the reign of Leo III. Now, while roundly condemned as an iconoclast by later sources, the evidence to link Leo III to an official iconoclast edict remains very limited. The initial opposition to icons actually began life as a grassroots movement within the provincial church. It is first documented in the 720s in two letters from the Patriarch Germanos of Constantinople to a churchman named Constantine, who was resident in what is now modern Turkey. In the letters, Germanos rebuked Constantine for refusing to bow before images and venerate them, and then failing to uphold church tradition. Now, by the 730s, these ideas had spread much further. A third letter, addressed to Thomas of Claudiopolis, also in Turkey, was much stronger in its tone, and it condemned Thomas for having removed icons from his church. These letters indicate, between the 720s and the 730s, the main fault lines between the pro-image and anti-image arguments had already begun to develop. But an official imperial stance was not to be taken until the mid-8th century, during the reign of Leo's son, Constantine V. Now, Constantine V's anti-image arguments are not detailed until around about 750, when he wrote a work known as Questions, Pusis. And this work now survives only as fragments in a 9th century refutation, but here are two of them. Now, these two positions were endorsed at a church council at the Palace of Hieria in 754, which formally banned the production and veneration of icons. And in their place, Constantine advocated for a renewed focus on the Eucharist, the bread and wine of the communion, as the only true image of Christ, and of course, the symbolic importance of the cross. Now, Constantine's anti-image position forced pro-image churchmen to formulate their own defence of images. And among them was the monk John of Damascus, whose 3 treatises in defence of images were among the most influential works in establishing the main points of icon veneration. Now, much like Constantine V's position, John's defence rested on a combination of Christology, arguments about the nature of Christ, and the power of church tradition. Now, the pro-image positions articulated by John and his contemporaries gained their most coherent form a generation later in the proceedings of the Second Council of Nicaea in 787. The rulings of the 787 Council established the groundwork for the cult of icons, which has remained a central feature of Orthodox Christianity ever since. The practices of kissing icons, performing prostration before them, honouring them with candles or incense can be first traced back to the protocols of 787. Now, the ideas set out in the Iconoclast 754 Horus and the pro-image meeting of 787 were to have lasting implications for the debate over images in the following century. A brief reinstatement of iconoclasm in Constantinople in 815 drew heavily on the iconoclast principles first set out in 754. In 843, when the synod which permanently re-established icons was convened, it also legitimised its position through references to the arguments of people like John of Damascus a century earlier. The level of image destruction linked to the ruling of the iconoclast councils remains highly speculative. But what is clear is the extent to which the eventual iconophile victory in 843 sparked an almost systematic revision of the history of iconomachy. The ability of the iconophiles to essentially rewrite and control the memory of that struggle and those embroiled within it remains the most enduring legacy of Byzantine iconoclasm. So to conclude, the value of Byzantine iconoclasm today lies less in the physical act of destruction and more about what it tells us about the nature of power and counterpower in our world. In their emphasis on the leadership of priests and the rituals of the church, the Byzantine iconoclasts effectively sought to enshrine a hierarchy of belief which privileged the institutional, the elite, and the male in human interactions with the divine. In their appeal to the universal senses of sight and touch, the iconophile view championed an alternative relationship that was less hierarchical and centered on an individual's power to commune with his or her creator. It is perhaps not unsurprising that the popular appeal of the image eventually won out. As the destruction of statues in the 21st century also shows, the ability of iconoclasm to shed light on those essential tensions between the institutional and the popular, and the power to define memory and history, continues to give relevance to those debates over 1,000 years later. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We have a few minutes for... What is the importance of this discussion in later Christianity? What has been the influence after 1453?
It was, the ideas set out were incredibly influential during the Reformation as well, on both sides of the argument in terms of the Catholic Church's support for icon veneration, but also as a sort of source material for the basis of the Protestant objection to image veneration as well. But the broader questions have always popped up in terms of trying to understand the relationship between the image and what it seeks to represent and its prototype, and whether or not when one seeks to venerate or attack an image, what is it are they actually attacking? Is it the physical image itself, made of wood or stone, or is it the idea or the image behind it? So those ideas were very influential in the 16th century as well.
And how does it affect the idea of worship then?
Well, this is a point of contention. So particularly in terms of pro-image arguments, one of the main distinctions which is made is the distinction between veneration and worship. And this is something that John of Damascus particularly is very keen to delineate. The idea that when you venerate an image of the Virgin Mary, you are not worshipping her as a god, you are simply venerating her position within Christianity. And that veneration is directed at the Virgin, not at the wooden object itself. But worship is something which is due to God alone. And that is, again, a point of contention between both the iconoclasts and the iconophile positions.
Is Christianity complicated because God is God and also has, as you told us, a human form?
Yes, and this is again one of the key points of debate. And iconoclasm and many of its debates is as much about the nature of the incarnation as it is about images themselves. So when John argues in defense of images, one of his key arguments is to say the reason why we can make images of Christ is because he appeared on earth as a human. And so therefore to not make images of Christ is to deny that ever took place, which is a heresy. Of course, the iconoclasts viewed that if you depict Christ in his human form, what you are effectively doing is splitting off his humanity from his divinity, which is also a heresy. So this debates about images within Byzantium are as much about this relationship between God the Father and God the Son. And a lot of this, I would argue, is also provoked by the emergence of Islam within the Mediterranean, which again makes the issue of the incarnation a very pertinent one in terms of a broader Mediterranean discussion about the divine. So.